Chapter 12. Darkness had settled fully by the time Alexander reached the lab, the corridors emptied of voices, the glass walls reflecting only his own silhouette as he passed. The building felt different at this hour, less like a place of innovation and more like a cathedral built for machines. Every step echoed as he moved, every motion felt observed, even now, even here. He keyed in, bypassed secondary checks, and stepped inside his workspace. The lights came on in soft gradients, revealing the familiar constellation of terminals, fiber conduits, and sealed racks that housed Lumiere's physical spine. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there, breathing, letting the hum of the cooling systems wash over him. It sounded alive and waiting. He crossed the room and activated the primary console. Lumiere unfolded on the display in layered abstractions, quantum states dancing in visual metaphors meant for human eyes, never quite accurate but close enough to suggest the scale of what lived beneath. This was not code in the ordinary sense. It was a logic that did not move in straight lines, a system designed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. Alexander lowered himself into the chair, his hands hovering above the controls without touching them. He felt, suddenly, like an intruder in his own creation. "I named you wrong," he murmured, not sure why he spoke at all. "You're not light, you're gravity." The name Lumiere had come to him years ago, late one night, after Max had refused to sleep. Max had been 6 then, restless, full of questions that tumbled over one another without pause. They had been lying on the living room floor, the lights off, only the city glow bleeding in through the windows. "Why can't we see the internet?" Max had asked. Alexander had smiled, amused. "Because it's not made of things you can see. Then how do we know it's there?" Alexander had thought for a moment before answering. "Because things change when it's there. Messages arrive, lights turn on, doors open." Max had gone quiet, absorbing that. Then he had pointed at the ceiling, where passing headlights cast shifting patterns of brightness. "So it's like light," he'd said. "You don't see it unless it hits something." That had been the moment. That simple, careless sentence from a child had settled somewhere deep inside Alexander and refused to leave. Light as carrier, light as proof of presence. Light as something that could cross impossible distances and still arrive intact. Lumiere had begun there. Now, years later, staring at the system in its full, terrible beauty, Alexander felt the memory twist inside him. Max's voice echoed in his head, not as sound but as weight. "Papa. When are you coming back? I'll wait for you." He leaned forward, finally touching the console. Streams of diagnostics cascaded across the screen as Lumiere responded, adjusting. It recognized him, of course it did. He had built it that way, entangled authentication bound not to passwords, but to physical constants measured in the way his hands moved, the cadence of his inputs, the subtle irregularities that could not be copied without knowing him intimately. Or so he had believed. His gaze drifted to a secondary panel. Whoever had tried to observe Lumiere had done so with extraordinary restraint. They had not touched the core. They had not disrupted the lattice. They had watched from the edges, mapping absence. They had known exactly what they were doing. Sarah's voice surfaced uninvited in his mind. "You know what you've built?" Yes, he did. He had built something that could move information without leaving footprints. Something that made surveillance obsolete and secrecy absolute. Something that could erase borders not by crossing them, but by rendering them irrelevant. Governments would kill for it, corporations would sell their souls, intelligence networks would trade wars to own it. And one of them already wanted it badly enough to threaten his life. Alexander pushed back from the console and stood, suddenly unable to breathe in that room. The air felt too dense, charged with the consequences he has been refusing to fully imagine. He shut Lumiere down and walked away. The lab lights dimmed automatically as he left, sensing his departure. He didn't look back. In the kitchenette down the hall, he filled the kettle and set it to boil, his movements robotic. He reached for the tin of Moroccan tea he had brought from home months ago, the one thing he had insisted on keeping close no matter how busy life became. He prepared it carefully, the way his mother had taught him, the way he always had. Rinse the leaves, let them breathe, then pour high to aerate to wake the flavor. The ritual steadied him, anchored him in something older than everything around him. He carried the cup outside to the small terrace reserved for after-hours staff, though no one else was there now. The night air was cool, the city stretched below him in fractured light. San Francisco glittered, indifferent and alive, unaware of the private war unfolding within its people. Alexander leaned against the railing and took a slow sip. "What are you going to do?" he asked the empty space beside him, as if talking to someone or some wiser version of himself. He tried to think logically, he always had. Break the problem into parts, evaluate outcomes, optimize. If he refused Sarah's offer, what then? The legal path had already proven itself useless. Courts had delayed, reframed, dismissed. Police had smiled politely while doing nothing. Systems had closed ranks around Layla not because she was right, but because she belonged. He had exhausted every lawful option available to him, spent money, time, dignity. He had crossed continents chasing justice and found only procedure weaponized against him. And now, even from thousands of miles away, those same forces had followed him, had watched him, had tried to frighten him into submission. And Max would grow up without him. His life will be shaped by choices Alexander would never get to influence. He will be taught to forget his father slowly, gently, until the memory dulled into something abstract. A voice on the phone, perhaps, a face in old photos, Papa reduced to a story. Alexander closed his eyes if he accepted Sarah's deal. He didn't need to finish the thought to feel the weight of it. This was a betrayal, not just of a country, but of a trust he had never questioned until now. The work he had done had been funded under assumptions of defense, of progress, of restraint. Lumiere had been built with safeguards precisely because he had feared what it could become in the wrong hands, and Sarah's hands were not clean. She hadn't pretended otherwise. Power, she had said, clean power. He imagined Lumiere repurpose, wrapped in secrecy agreements and black budgets, it being used not to protect but to dominate. Wars fought in silence, lives altered without evidence, history rewritten without trace. Could he live with that? He stared out at the city again, his reflection faint in the glass. Could I live without him? He asked quietly. The answer came immediately, brutally. No. His hands tightened around the cup. The tea had gone cold, but he drank it anyway, welcoming the bitterness. He thought of Max's room back home, untouched. Of the way Max used to leave his toys arranged exactly where he had last played, convinced he would return to them unchanged. Of the trust in his eyes when he said, "I'll wait for you." "I tried," Alexander said aloud, his voice cracking. "I tried every way they tell you you're supposed to." He paced the terrace now, words spilling out as if someone were listening. "I filed the papers, I hired the lawyers. I followed the rules. I believed that if I did everything right it would work out, that there was a system designed to protect children, to protect parents." He laughed once, sharp and humorless. What a lie. The system hadn't protected Max, it had protected itself. "And now you expect me to keep believing in lines and laws," he continued, anger rising. "You expect me to sacrifice my son on the altar of principles that never protected him in the first place." He stopped, gripping the railing again. Below, the cars paced constant and uncaring. "I am his father," he said more firmly now. "That has to mean something." He imagined Max older, asking why he hadn't come sooner. Why he hadn't done more. What excuse could possibly satisfy a child abandoned by bureaucracy? "I chose the right thing," Alexander might say. "I chose the lawful thing." Even in his imagination, the words sounded hollow. A father doesn't choose abstract good over a living child. A father chooses the child, again and again, no matter the cost. The realization didn't come as a dramatic epiphany. It settled slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a glass, heavy and inescapable. He had already lost parts of himself in this fight, his safety, certainty, his faith in institutions. What remained was the core of him, the part that had held Max as a baby, that had whispered promises in the courtroom. "I won't lose you," he said softly, as if Max could hear him across oceans and locked doors. Alexander finished the tea and set the cup down, hands steady now. The fear was still there, the doubt, the knowledge that whatever he chose would scar him permanently, but beneath it all was clarity. He went back inside. The lab greeted him again. He powered Lumiere back up, watching the system reassemble itself piece by piece. He saw it differently now, not as a triumph, not as a danger, but as a bargaining chip. a weapon, a key to something bigger than itself. "I'm sorry," he told it, not the system but the idea behind it, the hope he had once attached to it. He began outlining changes in his mind, not technical ones yet, but strategic. What could be given without giving everything? What could be delayed? What could be hidden even from those who thought they were in control? If he was going to step into this, he would not do it blindly. He would protect Max, and he would protect himself enough to survive what came after. Outside, the city slept on, unaware that somewhere in its depths, a man had made a decision that would ripple far beyond what they could imagine. A decision forged not in ambition or ideology, but in love sharpened by desperation. There was no right answer, only how far a father would go. The cards surfaced the way truths always did, by accident, when he wasn't looking for them. Alexander found it tucked inside the inner pocket of his coat, the one he wore when he met Sarah. Matte black, it had no log, no embossing, no name, just a weightless rectangle that felt heavier than it should have when he slid it between his fingers. At first he only stared at it as if it might change its mind and say something on its own. "No numbers, no names, you know how to reach me." And beneath that, in neat, almost indifferent type, Parcel E, Unit 14B, Hunter's Point, Alexander exhaled slowly. Hunter's Point Naval Shipyard wasn't just obscure, it was deliberately inconvenient. Half-abandoned buildings folded into federal oversight and private redevelopment projects that never quite finished becoming real. A place where addresses existed on paper more than they did in public consciousness. You didn't stumble into Hunter's Point, you were sent there. He turned the card over as if the back might confess something the front refused to. Blank, of course, designed carefully, he thought, meticulous, almost reverent in its secrecy. That was when it settled in, not just that Sarah was careful, but that she wasn't the most careful person in the room. Whoever stood behind her, whoever had decided this was worth the effort, was playing a long game. One that involved buffers and people who could disappear without leaving so much as a digital ripple. Rees Remen fit that shape uncomfortably well. But the more Alexander thought about it, the more another, colder thought surfaced. He closed his fist around the card. He hated how effective it was. Back in his house, the city went on as if nothing had changed. Life went on with an almost insulting normalcy while Alexander stood in the middle of his living room, weighing how much silence a secret like this demanded, and how long it could survive. Arian would notice, not immediately but soon enough. He always did. Too many late nights, too many locked terminals, too many answers that came a second too late. Lumiere wasn't something you could quietly hand over in pieces, it was a living architecture, a system that bore the fingerprints of its maker no matter how carefully you wiped them away. And Max, the thought struck him with the same sharpness every time, as if his mind refused to dull the blade. Max laughing, Max asking questions, Max believing, still believing that his father could fix anything if he just tried hard enough. Alexander ran a hand through his hair and let out a breath that felt more like a fracture. He couldn't give Lumiere to them, he couldn't not meet her again. Both things were true and neither canceled the other out. He slipped the card back into his pocket, this time deliberately, like a decision he wasn't ready to announce. If he was going to do this, and some part of him already knew he would, then it wouldn't be blind. He needed more than promises and photographs and carefully curated half-truths. He needed to know who exactly thought Lumiere belonged to them, what they planned to turn it into, and how quickly a favor could become a leash. He stood by the window for a long time before moving to his room. The card lay on the table behind him, unseen but acutely present, like a thought he couldn't outrun. Every step towards it would be his, and that was what frightened him most. No hand was pushing him out the door, no threat was being spoken aloud. This was consent dressed up as inevitability. He thought of how carefully Sarah had spoken, how every sentence had left him space to argue, to refuse, to walk away, while quietly ensuring that none of those options were survivable. He wondered how many men before him had stood exactly like this, telling themselves they were only going to listen, only to ask questions, only to buy time. Time, he knew now, was the most expensive currency of all. He turned back towards the room, towards the life he was about to fracture. He imagined Arian noticing his absence, tracing the gaps in his explanations, feeling the unease settle in his bones. He imagined Max not in danger at this moment, not crying or afraid, worse than that, trusting. That trust pressed against his ribs until it hurt to breathe. If he didn't go, nothing would happen immediately. The world would not end tonight. But something would begin closing in, slowly, patiently, until choice itself was no longer offered. Alexander picked up the card at last, feeling how easily it slid between his fingers, how little resistance it gave. That, he realized, was the most terrifying part. Whatever waited for him in Hunter's Point wasn't forcing him forward. It was simply waiting, certain that he would come.